Her cottage light still glowed warm against the December darkness. Her car sat perfectly parked in its usual spot, as if waiting for a journey that would never begin. The only signs that something had gone terribly wrong were her house keys lying forgotten in the gravel driveway and her favorite woolen scarf, patterned with foxes she had pointed out to her young students, caught on the wrought iron garden gate, as if reaching back toward safety. Where did 28-year-old Emily Thornfield vanish to after leaving the staff Christmas party at the Crown and Thistle, disappearing somewhere between the pub's cheerful farewell wishes and the short walk to her front door? In the quiet villages of Essex, some secrets refused to stay buried beneath the ancient soil. Emily moved through life with a particular kind of enthusiasm only dedicated primary school teachers possess, finding genuine wonder in small discoveries, maintaining patience through daily chaos, and treating each child's question with the gravity of philosophical inquiry. 2 years after arriving in Wrenfield village to teach at St. Margaret's Primary, she had transformed her classroom into what parents described as a little museum of curiosities, walls covered with local historical maps, nature specimens carefully labeled on windowsills, and children's artwork celebrating the village's ancient landmarks. She brought a historian's mind to teaching 8-year-olds, Headmaster Robert Jenkins would later tell investigators. Emily saw Wrenfield not just as a picturesque village, but as layers of stories waiting to be excavated and shared. She believed children should understand they were part of a continuous human story stretching back centuries in the same soil. This perspective had quickly endeared her to many in the community, while raising occasional eyebrows among those who preferred certain aspects of local history remain undisturbed. Her integration into village life had been swift but selective, joining the Historical Society within weeks of arrival, volunteering at the small local museum housed in the former stables of Thornley Manor, starting a children's archaeology club that conducted supervised digs on the village green. Yet she maintained a certain privacy about her personal life that some found refreshing and others slightly suspicious in a place where boundary lines between public and private often blurred across generations. December 16th, 1994 was the last day anyone saw Emily Thornfield alive. Winter settles early across Essex countryside, darkness falling by mid-afternoon and morning frost lingering in shadowed corners throughout the day. That Friday had brought typical December weather, cold but not bitter, occasional drizzle rather than proper rain, the kind of persistent dampness that seeps gradually through coats and scars despite best precautions. St. Margaret's had concluded its autumn term with a traditional Christmas concert, parents crowding the small assembly hall to watch their children perform carols and a somewhat chaotic nativity play before the 2-week holiday began. The staff gathering at the Crown and Thistle afterward was equally traditional, teachers celebrating surviving another term while sharing plans for break. Emily had seemed in particularly good spirits, according to multiple witnesses. She had spoken enthusiastically about using the holiday to complete her research for an article on Thornley Manor's medieval foundations, mentioning she had recently discovered something unexpected in the estate records she'd been cataloging for the Historical Society. She was being a bit mysterious about it, recalled Sarah Collins, who taught the Year 4 class alongside Emily's Year 3. When I pressed her, she just smiled and said some things needed proper verification before sharing, but that it might change how people understood certain local families. I thought she was just being dramatic. Emily loved a good historical mystery, but now I wonder if she really had found something significant. The party began dispersing around 10:30 p.m., with Emily among the last to leave shortly after 11. Several colleagues offered her rides home, concerned about the dark walk to her cottage on Church Lane, but she declined cheerfully. "It's barely 5 minutes, and I've got my torch," she reportedly told them. "Besides, the fresh air will clear my head before tomorrow's research." Headmaster Jenkins watched from the pub doorway as she set off toward the village square, her red woolen scarf bright against her dark coat, the beam of her torch bobbing ahead of her along the familiar route she had walked hundreds of times before. 8:15 a.m., Saturday, December 17th. Sarah Collins arrives at Emily's cottage, concerned after Emily misses her planned breakfast meeting at the village cafe. She finds Emily's car parked normally, keys dropped in the driveway, scarf caught on the gate. The cottage door is unlocked but shows no signs of forced entry. Inside, everything appears normal, kettle filled as if prepared for morning tea, pajamas laid out on the bed, Christmas cards arranged on the mantelpiece. No sign of Emily herself. By 9:30 a.m., the first police officers had arrived from the nearby town of Braintree, initially treating the case as a potential missing person rather than suspected crime. This categorization shifted quickly as they noted several concerning elements. Emily's handbag containing her wallet remained on the kitchen table. Her asthma inhaler, which colleagues insisted she carried religiously, sat on her bedside table, and despite the cold December night, no additional clothing beyond what she had worn to the pub appeared to be missing. Most tellingly, Emily's cottage showed subtle signs of disruption that a casual observer might miss, but police training immediately identified. A potted plant on the windowsill had been recently disturbed, with soil spilled onto the carpet below. A kitchen chair was positioned at an odd angle, as if hastily pushed back. The back door key, normally kept on a hook by the refrigerator, according to Sarah Collins, was missing from its usual place. These details collectively suggested someone else had been in the cottage, someone who had taken care to avoid obvious signs of intrusion or struggle. Detective Inspector Malcolm Richards, assigned as lead investigator from Essex Police's Major Crime Unit, recognized immediately that time would be critical. The first 48 hours in a potential abduction case provide our best opportunity for resolution, he noted in his initial assessment. Miss Thornfield's disappearance shows concerning indicators of foul play rather than voluntary departure. The presence of her car, wallet, and necessary medication suggests she did not leave willingly or with planning. The search began with systematic thoroughness, expanding outward from Emily's cottage in carefully documented grid patterns. Officers conducted house-to-house inquiries throughout Wrenfield, a task complicated by the village's social dynamics. With barely 800 residents, many related through generations of intermarriage, information passed through established channels influenced by loyalties and alliances invisible to outsiders. Some villagers provided detailed accounts of movements and observations from the previous evening, while others displayed a reflexive reticence toward authority typical of rural communities. Wrenfield presents specific investigative challenges. Richards observed after the first day of canvassing. The close-knit nature of the community means information is filtered through existing relationships before reaching officers. Residents instinctively consider potential implications for neighbors and family members before sharing observations, particularly when those observations might cast suspicion on established village figures. The physical search expanded to include grounds of Thornley Manor, the medieval estate at Wrenfield's Edge where Emily had been conducting historical research. The current owners, Richard and Helena Thornley, descendants of the original family who had built the manor house in the 16th century, expressed shock at Emily's disappearance and provided full access to the estate's extensive grounds. Specialist teams with dogs searched the formal gardens, woodlands, and outbuildings throughout the weekend, finding no significant evidence despite the comprehensive coverage. As the investigation continued into the critical second day, forensic examination of Emily's cottage revealed subtle but concerning evidence. An unidentified fingerprint was recovered from the bedroom window frame. Significant because Emily had reportedly mentioned to colleagues that she sometimes heard noises outside this window in recent weeks. Soil found on the passenger side floor mat of her car differed from the composition in her garden or driveway, suggesting it had been transferred from another location. Most troublingly, her phone record showed multiple calls from an unidentified number in the weeks before her disappearance, calls that had typically come late in the evening and lasted only seconds before disconnecting. These elements collectively painted a picture of someone who had potentially been observed and targeted over a period of time rather than selected opportunistically. The possibility that Emily had been monitored before her disappearance directed investigative attention toward her recent activities and relationships, particularly her research at Thornley Manor and involvement with the Historical Society. Emily was particularly interested in the estate's history between 1930 and 1960, explained Margaret Wilson, chairperson of the Wrenfield Historical Society. She had been cataloging correspondence and financial records from that period, creating a proper archival system for materials that had previously been stored haphazardly in the estate's old steward's office. She seemed especially interested in shipping records and correspondence with certain museums and private collectors during the post-war period. This focus became potentially significant when investigators discovered Emily had recently requested copies of import documentation from the Essex Records office relating to antiquities brought into Britain through Harwich Port during the 1950s. Her notebook, found in her cottage, contained references to discrepancies in provenance and questionable acquisition methods alongside the names of several prominent local families, including the Thornleys themselves. As the search for Emily continued throughout the week before Christmas, with specialized teams dragging the village pond and examining abandoned farm buildings in the surrounding countryside, a picture emerged of a dedicated historian who might have discovered information certain influential figures prefer to remain buried in the past. Her research into Thornley Manor's history had apparently extended beyond academic interest in medieval foundations to the more recent and potentially problematic activities of the current owner's parents and grandparents. She mentioned finding something that changed her understanding of certain local treasures, Sarah Collins recalled during her second interview. I assumed she meant architectural features or historical events, but thinking back, she seemed more concerned than excited. She said she needed to speak with someone who could provide context before drawing conclusions, but that she had a moral obligation to follow the evidence where it leads. By Christmas Eve, with no body discovered and no definitive evidence of what had happened after Emily left the pub, the case settled into a particular limbo of investigations where foul play seems likely, but conclusive proof remains elusive. Her cottage had been thoroughly processed for evidence, her research materials carefully preserved, and interviews conducted with everyone who had known her in Wrenfield. What remained missing was a critical connection between her historical discoveries and her physical disappearance, the evidentiary link that would transform speculation into actionable investigation. As sleet fell across Essex that Christmas, Emily Thornfield joined the ranks of the missing, her absence marked by a darkened cottage that should have glowed with holiday lights, an empty classroom awaiting a teacher who would never return, and historical research left tantalizingly incomplete in neat folders stacked on her small writing desk. The village of Wrenfield continued its centuries-old Christmas traditions beneath a thin veneer of normalcy, while beneath that surface, currents of suspicion, fear, and selective silence rippled through a community suddenly aware that someone among them likely knew exactly what had happened to the enthusiastic young teacher who had asked too many questions about the past. What no one could have anticipated then was how the methodical preservation of seemingly minor evidence, soil samples, fingerprints, phone records, would eventually converge with technological advancements to reveal truths that had remained buried for nearly 3 decades. The answers to Emily's disappearance lay waiting in the very history she had been researching, concealed beneath layers of respectability and tradition that had protected certain secrets across generations until science and persistence finally brought them into the light. The initial investigation into Emily Thornfield's disappearance created one of Essex Police's most methodically documented yet ultimately frustrating case files of the 1990s. Detective Inspector Malcolm Richards, who had built his reputation solving complex rural crimes across East Anglia, applied every investigative technique available at the time, only to watch promising leads dissolve into ambiguity against the backdrop of Wrenfield Village's protective silence. Small communities present unique investigative challenges. Richards noted in his case assessment, information flows freely within established networks, but becomes remarkably scarce when outsiders ask questions. In places like Wrenfield, with generations of intertwined histories and loyalties, truth becomes filtered through calculations about community implications before ever reaching official channels. This dynamic shaped the investigation from its earliest stages. The house-to-house inquiries conducted throughout that December weekend revealed selective recollection that followed clear social patterns. Newer village residents provided detailed observations without apparent reservation. Long-established families offered carefully limited information, answering direct questions, while volunteering nothing beyond what was specifically asked. Most telling were the subtle differences in how Emily herself was described. Praise for her teaching by everyone, but with noticeable variations in how her interest in local history was characterized. Most telling were the subtle differences in how Emily herself was described. Praise for her teaching by everyone, but with noticeable variations in how her interest in local history was characterized. She brought fresh perspectives to our historical understanding, noted the vicar, Reverend Thomas Hartley, who had worked with Emily on cataloging the church's ancient parish records, perhaps occasionally too eager to revisit settled matters, but always with scholarly intention. This mild reservation found stronger expression in other interviews. Richard Thornley, the current owner of Thornley Manor, described Emily as somewhat fixated on obscure historical minutiae that have little relevance to present circumstances. Helena Thornley went further, suggesting Emily exhibited a troubling tendency to view historical figures through contemporary moral frameworks, judging actions taken during wartime and post-war recovery by today's standards. These comments gained significance when investigators discovered Emily had been researching the manor's activities during and after World War II, particularly focusing on the Thornley family's acquisition of various antiquities between 1945 and 1955. Her notes, recovered from her cottage in the Historical Society archives, documented a pattern of artifacts arriving from Mediterranean countries during a period when export restrictions were either suspended due to war conditions or inadequately enforced during Reconstruction. Emily had been tracing shipping records connecting Harwich Port to Thornley Holdings, explained Margaret Wilson of the Historical Society. She was particularly interested in items that appeared in the family's collection during this period without clear provenance documentation: Roman sculptures, Greek pottery, certain Egyptian artifacts that now form the centerpiece of their private collection. This research direction provided the investigation's first substantial theory. Emily might have discovered evidence of historical impropriety in antiquities acquisition, essentially identifying potential illegal trafficking from war-damaged countries by the current owner's parents and grandparents. Such discoveries could potentially damage both the Thornley family's reputation and the financial value of their collection if items were proven to have been improperly obtained. While this created a potential motive, physical evidence from the cottage offered more immediate investigative paths. The unexplained soil on Emily's car floor map became a focus of extensive analysis. Forensic examination identified it as containing distinctive clay composition, not matching her garden, the village green, or initial samples from Thornley Manor's formal gardens. This suggested Emily's car had recently been somewhere significant enough to transfer substantial soil, yet not part of her known routine movements. The unidentified fingerprint recovered from her bedroom window provided another promising lead. Comparison against criminal databases yielded no matches, but its position on the exterior frame supported Emily's reported concerns about someone possibly observing her. Most concerning were the phone records showing 7 brief calls from an unidentified number in the 3 weeks before her disappearance, calls made between 11 p.m. and midnight that connected for only seconds before terminating. The evidence collectively suggests surveillance preceding the disappearance, Richards documented in his investigative summary. Miss Thornfield appears to have been observed, possibly followed, and specifically targeted rather than being a victim of opportunity. The question becomes who in Wrenfield would have both motive and capacity to conduct such activities. The investigation expanded to examine everyone with connections to Thornley Manor, the Historical Society, and potential knowledge of antiquities value. Background checks revealed Harold Winters, the manor's elderly groundskeeper and caretaker, had served in North Africa and Italy during World War II before returning to work on the estate, where his family had been employed for generations. His military record included specialized training in logistics, potentially relevant to understanding shipping operations, but interviews with Winters yielded little beyond general expressions of concern about Emily's disappearance. "Harold practically raised me," Richard Thornley told investigators when questioned about the caretaker. "He's been with the family since before I was born, knows every corner of the estate better than I do myself. Complete loyalty, absolute discretion, the kind of service that barely exists anymore. The suggestion that he might have relevant information about Miss Thornfield strikes me as rather desperate investigative reaching." This assessment reflected a broader pattern emerging throughout the village: protective closing of ranks around established figures while maintaining outward cooperation with the investigation. Long-time residents provided carefully limited information, answering specific questions while offering no volunteered insights. Newcomers to the village, lacking these generational connections, proved more forthcoming but possessed less potentially relevant knowledge of historical matters and established relationships. By January 1995, with Emily still missing and no body, recovered despite extensive searches, the investigation reached its first significant obstacle: the lack of definitive crime scene. Without physical confirmation of what had happened after she left the pub, Investigators worked from circumstantial evidence suggesting foul play, but insufficient to support specific charges or warrant more intrusive investigative measures against identified persons of interest. This limitation became most apparent when a search warrant request for certain areas of Thornley Manor was declined by the magistrate, who cited insufficient specific evidence connecting the disappearance to interior spaces not included in the initial consensual search. This decision effectively prevented investigators from examining the manor's extensive cellars and certain outbuildings where family collections were stored, spaces that might contain evidence related to both Emily's research and potentially her disappearance. We faced the classic cold case conundrum, Richards later explained during a professional conference. We could establish that Emily Thornfield had likely been researching potentially damaging historical information. We could demonstrate she had almost certainly encountered foul play rather than leaving voluntarily. What we couldn't establish was a definitive connection between these elements, the evidentiary link that would transform theoretical narrative into prosecutable case. The investigation continued through systematic pursuit of every available lead. Soil samples from across the region were collected for comparison with the material found in Emily's car. Telephone records were exhaustively analyzed to identify the source of the anonymous calls. The fingerprint was compared against expanded databases, including military and government personnel. Each effort yielded incremental information, but no definitive breakthrough. By March 1995, with resources necessarily shifting to new cases, the active investigation transitioned to the periodic review status. Emily's cottage had been thoroughly processed, her research materials carefully preserved, and interviews conducted with everyone who had known her in Wrenfield. The physical evidence, soil samples, fingerprint images, phone records, remained properly stored against the possibility of future technological advances or new information emerging. For Wrenfield Village, Emily's unresolved disappearance created subtle but permanent changes in community dynamics. Parents became more protective of children, previously allowed to roam freely through the countryside. The Historical Society's open access to Thornley Manor archives became more formalized and restricted. Most visibly, Emily's cottage on Church Lane remained unoccupied, local superstition and practical concerns about an unsolved case making it effectively unlettable despite the village's limited housing. The case periodically resurfaced in regional news, particularly around anniversaries or when similar disappearances occurred elsewhere in Essex. Each renewed media attention brought fresh witness appeals and temporary reassignment of investigative resources, but without new evidence emerging, these efforts gradually diminished in scope and expectation. Emily's parents, who had relocated from Yorkshire to stay close to the investigation during its early months, eventually returned north, maintaining regular contact with Essex police but recognizing the diminishing likelihood of resolution without new information. Detective Inspector Richards maintained personal involvement even after his official reassignment, periodically reviewing the file and pursuing specialized analysis as new technologies became available. The soil samples underwent increasingly sophisticated geological examination. The fingerprint was resubmitted to expanding identification databases. The phone records were reanalyzed using advanced pattern recognition software. Each effort yielded incremental improvements in understanding without providing the definitive connection needed for case resolution. Emily Thornfield represented the most challenging type of investigation. Richards noted in his final case review before retirement in 2010, "We know with reasonable certainty that she encountered foul play connected to her historical research. We have physical evidence that should connect to the perpetrator. We have identified rational suspects with both motive and opportunity. What we've never established is a definitive evidential chain linking these elements, the smoking gun that transforms theoretical narrative into prosecutable case." This assessment proved prescient in identifying both the case's challenges and its potential for eventual resolution. The evidence carefully preserved since 1994 contained the answers needed, preserved in soil compositions, fingerprint ridges, and partial DNA traces recovered from Emily's scarf. The methodical original investigation had gathered materials whose evidentiary value would only be fully realized decades later when scientific advances finally provided the analytical capabilities to extract their secrets. Throughout this period, Wrenfield Village maintained its outward tranquility while carrying the subtle burden of unresolved mystery. The annual rhythm of rural life continued. Harvest festivals, Christmas concerts, summer fetes, each passing year adding another layer of normalization over the community's most significant modern tragedy. For newer residents, Emily Thornfield gradually transformed from recent shocking event to village history, a story told with the same mixture of fact and speculation as centuries-old legends about Thornley Manor's medieval foundations. Yet beneath this surface adjustment, certain villagers maintain more direct connections to the unresolved case. Margaret Wilson continued preserving Emily's research materials within the Historical Society archives, ensuring they remain available for future investigation. Sarah Collins, who had discovered Emily missing that December morning, maintained annual remembrance by placing flowers on the empty cottage's doorstep each anniversary. Most significantly, Harold Winters continued his duties as caretaker at Thornley Manor, his aging figure a daily presence throughout the estate grounds as he maintained the property with the same meticulous attention he had demonstrated for over 40 years. What no one in Wrenfield, neither long-established families nor more recent arrivals, could have anticipated was how dramatically investigative capabilities would evolve in the decades following Emily's disappearance. The physical evidence collected during those December days in 1994, preserved through the dedication of career officers who recognized its potential value, would eventually speak with scientific clarity that transcended the village's protective silence and the passage of nearly 30 years. The initial investigation had laid essential groundwork, preserving critical evidence, documenting relevant relationships, establishing timelines and movements that would eventually support case resolution when technology finally provided tools capable of extracting the truth preserved in microscopic soil particles, latent fingerprints, and trace DNA. Emily Thornfield's disappearance had occurred at a pivotal moment in forensic history, just before revolutionary advances would transform cold case investigation, but early enough that proper evidence preservation protocols were already established. This timing would ultimately prove crucial when new eyes and new technologies finally converge on evidence that had waited patiently for science to advance sufficiently to reveal its secrets. The local connection that ultimately proved central to solving Emily Thornfield's disappearance emerged through her passionate involvement with the Wrenfield Historical Society and her meticulous research into Thornley Manor's past. What had initially appeared to be the academic curiosity of an enthusiastic young teacher gradually revealed itself as something far more significant, an investigation that had inadvertently uncovered secrets certain influential villagers had maintained for decades. In 2019, 25 years after Emily's disappearance, Detective Chief Inspector Laura Harrington assumed responsibility for Essex Police's Cold Case Review Unit. A forensic archaeology specialist before joining the police, Harrington brought unique perspective to cases involving historical elements and rural communities. Her review of the Thornfield file began with a comprehensive reassessment of Emily's research materials, preserved since 1994 in both police evidence storage and the Historical Society archives. Cold cases often contain their own solutions hidden in plain sight, Harrington noted in her initial assessment. Emily Thornfield wasn't just a victim. She was an investigator in her own right. Her historical research represents not just context for her disappearance, but potentially the direct cause. Understanding exactly what she discovered becomes as important as traditional forensic evidence. This approach led Harrington to conduct a detailed analysis of Emily's research notes, correspondence, and the historical documents she had been examining before her disappearance. Working with Dr. James Barrett, an antiquities specialist from Cambridge University, Harrington reconstructed Emily's investigative path through the Manor's archives, identifying specific documents that had captured her attention and the connections she had been establishing between seemingly unrelated historical records. Emily was conducting surprisingly sophisticated historical analysis, Dr. Barrett observed after reviewing her materials. She had identified a pattern in shipping records, insurance documents, and private correspondence that revealed systematic importation of antiquities from Greece, Egypt, and Italy between 1945 and 1955, precisely when these countries were experiencing post-war chaos and archaeological oversight had essentially collapsed. The documentation showed that Alfred Thornley, Richard's father, had served in British military intelligence during World War II, with postings throughout the Mediterranean. After the war, he maintained connections in the region while ostensibly working in art recovery, officially helping return looted cultural treasures to their countries of origin. Emily's research had revealed that during the same period, dozens of artifacts had arrived at Thornley Manor through Harwich Port, documented with suspiciously vague provenance information. She had essentially uncovered a historical smuggling operation, Harrington explained during a case briefing. Alfred Thornley appears to have been using his official position in art repatriation to divert significant artifacts to his family collection, items that should have been returned to their countries of origin or properly acquired through legitimate channels. This wasn't merely academic historical interest. Emily had identified potential crimes involving the current owner's father. This discovery gained legal significance through Emily's final research notes, found in a folder labeled Verification Required in her cottage. These documents indicated she had identified several specific artifacts currently displayed in Thornley Manor's private collection, pieces valued in the millions of pounds, that appeared on Italian government inventories of items missing after Allied operations in Naples. Most significantly, she had scheduled meetings with representatives from the British Museum and Italian Cultural Heritage Ministry for January 1995, appointments she would never keep. Emily wasn't just writing an academic paper about historical impropriety, Harrington concluded. She was preparing to provide evidence that could potentially lead to repatriation claims against the Thornley collection and serious reputational damage to one of the area's most prominent families. Her historical research had direct contemporary implications for both legal ownership and financial valuation of assets central to the Thornley family status. This connection transformed understanding of potential motives. The antiquities in question, Roman sculptures, Greek pottery, Etruscan jewelry, represented not just cultural artifacts, but assets valued in the millions. Current international law and evolving museum ethics increasingly supported repatriation of improperly acquired treasures to their countries of origin, regardless of how much time had passed. Emily's research threatened not just historical reputation, but present financial interests and social standing. With this context established, Harrington re-examined key relationships within Wrenfield Village, particularly focusing on the historical society members who would have been aware of Emily's research. Margaret Wilson, the elderly chairperson who had maintained Emily's archives for decades, provided crucial perspective during a new interview in 2020. Emily became increasingly cautious about sharing her findings as her research progressed, Wilson recalled. Initially, she discussed her work openly during society meetings, but by November 1994, she had become selective about which aspects she mentioned publicly. She told me privately that certain documents suggested deliberate misrepresentation of provenance that could have significant contemporary implications if verified. Most tellingly, Wilson revealed that Emily had expressed specific concern about Harold Winters, the manor's longtime caretaker. She mentioned finding his name in military records connected to Alfred Thornley's Mediterranean operations, not just as a family servant, but as someone who had worked directly in the artifact acquisition process. When she attempted to discuss this with him casually during her research visits, she said he became uncharacteristically short with her and subsequently seemed to be monitoring her activities around the estate. This information directed new attention toward Winters, now in his late 80s, but still living in the caretaker's cottage on the Thornley estate. The original investigation had interviewed him as a matter of routine, but never identified specific connections to Emily beyond his general duties, overseeing the grounds and buildings where she conducted research. Harrington's team conducted a comprehensive background review, revealing details not fully explored in 1994. Military records confirmed that Winters had indeed served alongside Alfred Thornley during post-war operations in Italy, assigned to a specialized unit involved in art recovery and cultural heritage protection. His role, officially documented as logistics and transport security, placed him directly in the chain of possession for artifacts being processed through British military channels. Most significantly, his name appeared on shipping manifests for multiple deliveries to Harwich Port between 1947 and 1952, the exact shipments Emily had been researching. Winters wasn't merely a family servant, Harrington noted. He was a direct participant in the acquisition activities Emily was investigating. His continued employment at Thornley Manor represented not just traditional service, but potentially ongoing concealment of historical impropriety that could have significant contemporary consequences. Financial records revealed another dimension to this relationship. While officially employed as the manor's caretaker, Winters had accumulated wealth seemingly inconsistent with his salary, including ownership of rental properties in nearby towns and substantial investment accounts. Most tellingly, he had received annual bonus payments from Thornley family trusts, documented as rewards for exceptional service and loyalty, but potentially representing ongoing compensation for his role in both acquiring and subsequently protecting the controversial collection. The local connection extended beyond individual relationships to implicate broader community knowledge and selective silence. Interviews with elderly Wrenfield residents, conducted with the benefit of 25 years' distance from events, revealed awareness that had been carefully concealed from the original investigation. There were always rumors about how the Thornley collection came to be so extensive after the war, admitted former parish council chairman George Bennett, now in his 90s. Alfred returned from Italy with crates that arrived at night, always accompanied by Winters rather than normal household staff. People understood asking questions wasn't in anyone's interest. The family employed half the village in those days, directly or indirectly. This community awareness had transformed into protective silence when Emily's research began approaching sensitive areas. Several historical society members acknowledged privately redirecting her inquiries away from certain periods or suggesting alternative research focuses. The vicar admitted removing specific parish records from church archives before granting Emily access, explaining he had pastoral responsibility to protect family reputations alongside historical documentation duties. Emily encountered a community-wide system designed to maintain selective historical memory, Harrington observed. Wrenfield's social structure had evolved specifically to protect certain narratives while suppressing others, particularly regarding the Thornley family's activities. Her research methodology, systematic, evidence-based, and unconcerned with social implications, represented a fundamental threat to this arrangement. The most significant local connection emerged through previously unexplored physical evidence. Emily's cottage had contained a hidden element overlooked during the original investigation, a loose floorboard in her study, concealing a space where she'd store her most sensitive research materials. This hiding place, discovered during a comprehensive re-examination of the still unoccupied cottage in 2020, contained a notebook documenting direct connections between current Thornley Manor artifacts and items listed in wartime Italian cultural heritage inventories. Most critically, this notebook included photographs Emily had surreptitiously taken of specific artifacts alongside copies of their original Italian documentation, creating unambiguous evidence of improper acquisition that would support repatriation claims. She had also documented a hidden storage room beneath the manor's east wing, not included in the building's official floor plans, but referenced in Harold Winters' maintenance logs, where additional undisplayed artifacts were apparently kept. Emily wasn't just researching historical events. She was documenting ongoing concealment, Harrington explained. Her notes indicate that both Richard Thornley and Harold Winters were actively maintaining the secrecy surrounding these acquisitions, not as historical curiosities, but as contemporary legal and financial concerns. She had essentially constructed a case that threatened both family reputation and significant assets. This documentary evidence transformed understanding of Emily's disappearance from isolated tragedy to direct consequence of her historical research. The local connection she had uncovered between wartime acquisition, current possession, and ongoing concealment created a web of motives extending beyond abstract historical interest to present-day legal, financial, and reputational concerns for Wrenfield's most influential family and their longest-serving retainer. The village's protective silence around these connections had effectively delayed resolution for decades, with social pressure and community loyalty creating barriers that conventional investigation couldn't easily penetrate. Emily's position as an outsider who had integrated enough to access historical materials, but not enough to absorb community reluctance about examining certain subjects, had made her both exceptionally effective at uncovering long-buried truths and particularly vulnerable to the consequences of that discovery. By 2021, Harrington's team had established a comprehensive understanding of how Emily's historical research connected to her disappearance. Her work had systematically documented improper antiquities acquisition that implicated not just the long-dead Alfred Thornley, but his son Richard, and particularly Harold Winters, whose ongoing role appeared to include maintaining secrecy around both historical activities and current possession of questionable artifacts. Her scheduled meetings with museum officials and cultural heritage representatives would have initiated processes potentially leading to repatriation claims worth millions of pounds. This local connection provided clear motive opportunity and specific knowledge of events surrounding December 16, 1994. What remained missing was definitive physical evidence linking identified suspects directly to Emily's disappearance and presumed murder, the forensic connection that would transform historical understanding into prosecutable case. This final element would emerge not through documentary evidence, but through technological advances applied to physical materials preserved since the original investigation. The careful preservation of soil samples, fingerprint images, and genetic material recovered from Emily's scarf would prove crucial when subjected to analytical methods unavailable during the initial investigation. The local connections Emily had meticulously documented through historical research would provide the framework for understanding physical evidence that advanced technology would finally make speak with scientific clarity after nearly 30 years of silence. Emily Thornfield had disappeared because her historical research threatened to expose secrets maintained across generations in Wrenfield village. The community connections that had initially impeded investigation, protective silence, selective memory, and institutional loyalty had delayed but ultimately couldn't prevent the truth from emerging when her documentation was finally combined with physical evidence preserved since that December night in 1994. The technological breakthrough that transformed the Thornfield investigation from historical theory to prosecutable case emerged through the application of scientific advancements that would have seemed like science fiction during the original 1994 investigation. What had been impossible for Detective Inspector Richards and his team to extract from evidence they had carefully preserved became increasingly accessible as forensic capabilities evolved to detect, identify, and analyze microscopic traces that had patiently waited nearly 3 decades for science to catch up with their evidentiary value. In May 2021, DCI Laura Harrington initiated comprehensive re-examination of all physical evidence using the most advanced analytical techniques available. This approach represented recognition that many cold cases contain their own solutions within long-preserved materials, solutions that remained inaccessible until technology advanced sufficiently to reveal them. The key to cold case resolution often lies in asking new scientific questions of old evidence. Harrington explained during a case review, the original investigators gathered materials using best practices of their time, preserving evidence whose full value could only be realized when analytical capabilities eventually caught up with investigative needs. The first major breakthrough came through advanced palynological analysis of soil samples recovered from Emily's car floor mat in December 1994. Traditional examination had identified the soil as not matching her garden, the village green, or samples from Thornley Manor's formal gardens. Modern palynology, the study of pollen and spores, offered far more precise capabilities for identifying a soil's exact origin through microscopic botanical signatures unique to specific locations. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers, a forensic palynologist with the Environmental Science Center at Essex University, conducted this specialized analysis using technologies developed primarily for climate change research. Her findings proved revelatory for the investigation. The soil contained a pollen signature that's botanically distinctive and geographically specific. Dr. Chambers reported, I identified pollen from Buxus sempervirens sufferticosa, a rare dwarf boxwood variety, along with Taxus baccata fastigiata and Cedrus atlantica glauca pendula. This specific combination represents a formal Victorian planting scheme that is extraordinarily uncommon in modern gardens. When asked if this combination could be located more precisely, Dr. Chambers was unequivocal. This pollen profile matches exactly with the private garden behind the caretaker's cottage at Thornley Manor, a formal Victorian knot garden maintained with original plantings since the 1880s. The soil composition, organic content, and pollen distribution indicate material transferred directly from that specific location, which occupies less than a quarter-acre land. This scientific certainty transformed understanding of Emily's movements on the night she disappeared. The soil in her car could only have come from the private garden behind Harold Winter's caretaker cottage, a restricted area not included in her known research visits, and with no legitimate reason for her presence there. More significantly, this location had not been included in consensual searches of the state conducted during the original investigation, as it constituted Winter's private residence rather than Thornley Manor proper. The second technological breakthrough came through advanced fingerprint analysis techniques applied to the unidentified print found on Emily's bedroom window frame. Traditional comparison had yielded no matches in 1994, but modern systems offered vastly expanded capabilities, including partial print reconstruction, ridge pattern probability analysis, and comparison against previously unidentified latent prints from other cases. Contemporary fingerprint identification represents quantum advancement over 1990s capabilities, explained forensic technician Robert Jong. Where previous systems required approximately 16 matching points for confident identification, current algorithms can establish statistical certainty from partial prints by analyzing microscopic ridge characteristics, sweat pore patterns, and pressure distributions invisible to earlier techniques. This advanced analysis identified the previously unmatched print as belonging to Harold Winters, a connection impossible to establish in 1994 because his prints weren't in criminal databases, in comparison against elimination prints from investigation participants had used older, less sensitive matching techniques. Modern analysis established statistical certainty exceeding 99.97%, confirming Winters had been at Emily's window sometime before her disappearance. The third and most definitive technological application involved touch DNA recovery from Emily's fox pattern scarf, the item found caught on her garden gate the morning after she vanished. Initial examination in 1994 had recovered microscopic biological material, but at quantities insufficient for DNA profiling using techniques available at that time. The material had been properly preserved, however, awaiting technological advances that could extract actionable genetic information from minimal samples. Touch DNA analysis has undergone revolutionary advancement, noted forensic geneticist Dr. Sophia Patel. Where earlier techniques required substantial biological material, visible blood, significant hair samples with follicles attached, abundant skin cells, modern methods can construct complete genetic profiles from microscopic trace deposits invisible to standard examination. Essentially, we can now identify individuals from the slightest physical contact with objects or surfaces. This capability proved transformative when applied to Emily's preserved scarf. Advanced recovery techniques identified genetic material from 4 individuals: Emily herself, Sarah Collins, who had handled the scarf when finding it, the evidence technician who had processed it in 1994, and a 4th contributor whose DNA didn't match anyone previously considered in the investigation. When compared against reference samples obtained during the renewed investigation, this 4th genetic profile conclusively matched Harold Winters. The distribution and transfer patterns of his genetic material on the scarf indicated direct physical contact, consistent with removing it forcibly rather than casual environmental transfer, a scientific finding that directly connected him to Emily at the time of her disappearance. These 3 technological breakthroughs, palynological identification of soil from Winters' private garden, advanced fingerprint matching confirming his presence at Emily's window, and touch DNA recovery establishing direct physical contact during her disappearance, converged to create an evidentiary foundation that had been impossible to construct with 1994 forensic capabilities. Science has finally allowed the evidence to speak with clarity it couldn't achieve 3 decades ago, Harrington observed. The technological advancements don't create new evidence. They reveal what was present all along, but beyond our capability to detect, identify, and analyze with sufficient certainty for legal proceedings. This scientific certainty enabled investigators to obtain a search warrant for Harold Winters' cottage and private garden, areas that had not been examined during the original investigation. The search, conducted in June 2022, yielded the case's most definitive evidence: a hidden storage space beneath the garden shed containing Emily's missing satchel with her research materials still inside, her house keys, and most significantly, jewelry she had been wearing the night she disappeared. Ground-penetrating radar examination of the Victorian knot garden identified a disturbed area beneath an ornamental stone feature installed in early 1995. Excavation revealed human remains later confirmed through dental records and DNA comparison as Emily Thornfield. Forensic anthropological examination identified fractures consistent with blunt force trauma to the skull as the likely cause of death, with positioning indicating hasty burial in the weeks following her disappearance. The technological breakthrough extended beyond identifying Winters as a perpetrator to establishing a comprehensive understanding of events on December 16, 1994. Advanced analytical techniques applied to soil residues, fabric fibers, and trace evidence recovered from both the cottage and garden created a scientifically supported timeline of Emily's final hours. She had left the pub, as witnesses recalled, walking toward her cottage on Church Lane. Sometime between the pub and her home, she had encountered Winters, who had either followed her or waited along her known route. A confrontation occurred, likely regarding her research discoveries, resulting in her being taken to his cottage, explaining both her keys dropped in her own driveway and her scarf caught on the gate. The soil in her car indicated she had been transported to the caretaker's cottage in her own vehicle, which was then returned to her home to suggest she had arrived safely. Physical evidence in Winters' cottage, preserved despite his cleaning efforts, indicated Emily had been killed there shortly afterward, with her body buried in the private garden where it remained undiscovered for 28 years. Most significantly, technological analysis of documents found in the hidden storage space revealed Emily had indeed assembled conclusive evidence connecting specific Thornley Manor artifacts to items illegally removed from Italian museums and archaeological sites during the post-war period. Her research had documented not just historical acquisition, but ongoing concealment, with Harold Winters identified as a key figure in both the original transport operations and subsequent maintenance of secrecy around the collection's problematic provenance. The technological advancements that solve this case represent the culmination of forensic evolution across 3 decades, noted forensic science director James Wilson during a presentation on the investigation. Palynology developed primarily for climate research, fingerprint algorithms created for border security applications, and genetic analysis techniques pioneered for medical diagnostics converged to extract evidence from materials that had waited patiently since 1994 for science to advance sufficiently to reveal their secrets. For the investigators who had maintained the case across decades, this technological resolution brought professional validation alongside personal satisfaction. The evidence carefully collected during those December days in 1994, soil samples, fingerprint lifts, fabric preservation, had contained the answers needed for resolution all along. The original investigation hadn't failed so much as encountered the temporal limitations of scientific capability, preserving materials whose evidentiary value could only be fully realized when technology eventually caught up with investigative needs. On August 17, 2022, Essex police arrested Harold Winters on charges of murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice in connection with Emily Thornfield's death. At 89, the once robust caretaker had become physically frail, but remained mentally acute, a man who had maintained his deception across 28 years while continuing to live and work within meters of where he concealed his victims' remains. When confronted with the technological evidence against him, the palynological certainty of soil transfer, the fingerprint identification, the touch DNA recovery, Winters initially maintained the dignified silence that had characterized his decades of service to the Thornley family. This composure collapsed, however, when shown the specific research materials recovered from his shed, Emily's meticulous documentation of his direct involvement in illegal antiquities, transport, and subsequent concealment. She wouldn't stop asking questions, he finally acknowledged during formal interview. Wouldn't accept that some history is better left unexamined. She found shipping records with my name, connected them to specific artifacts and collection, started asking about my service with Mr. Alfred in Italy. When she mentioned meeting with the Italian authorities after Christmas, I knew everything the family had built would be destroyed. Their reputation, their collection, their standing. Some secrets need protection, even when the cost is high. This confession, combined with the scientific evidence establishing both his direct involvement in Emily's death and his decades-long concealment of her remains, created an insurmountable case despite the 28 years that had passed. The technological breakthrough had not just identified a perpetrator, but reconstructed events with scientific precision that transcended both the passage of time and the community's silence that had initially impeded investigation. For Emily's parents, now elderly and living in retirement in Yorkshire, the technological resolution brought long-sought answers alongside renewed grief. The scientific certainty finally explained what happened to their daughter, while confirming their unwavering belief that she would never have abandoned her life and career voluntarily. The recovery of her remains, though deeply painful, allowed for proper burial after nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, a ritual closure they had been denied while her case remained unresolved. The technology that found Emily has given us answers we sought for half our lives, her father stated following Winter's arrest. It cannot return our daughter, but it has returned the truth about what happened to her, a truth we always believed would eventually emerge, though we sometimes feared we wouldn't live to see it. This truth, preserved in microscopic pollen grains, ridge patterns on glass, and genetic material on wool fibers, had waited patiently for science to advance sufficiently to give it voice. The technological breakthrough had transformed absence into certainty, speculation into evidence, and a decades-old mystery into a prosecutable case that would finally bring accountability for a young teacher whose only crime had been asking questions about history that certain individuals prefer to keep buried alongside its consequences. As Harold Winters awaited trial in HMP Chelmsford, the technological evidence against him continued accumulating through ongoing forensic examination of materials recovered from his cottage. The science that had finally penetrated his 30-year deception would ultimately ensure that neither community's silence nor the passage of time could prevent justice for a woman whose dedication to historical truth had cost her everything except, finally, that truth itself. The respected caretaker who orchestrated Emily Thornfield's murder had maintained an impeccable facade for nearly 3 decades, a performance of dedicated service and unassuming reliability that had placed him beyond serious scrutiny despite his proximity to the investigation's epicenter. Harold Winters, born in Wrenfield in 1933, had been a fixture in village life for so long that his presence had become virtually invisible, the perfect camouflage for someone concealing the darkest of secrets. In October 2022, as prosecutors prepared their case against the now 89-year-old Winters, a more comprehensive picture emerged of the man behind the carefully constructed persona of loyal family retainer. Forensic accountants examining his financial records, historical researchers analyzing his military service, and psychologists assessing his interview responses collectively assembled a portrait of calculated deception maintained across decades with extraordinary discipline. Winters represents an unusual category of offender, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Miranda Hughes, who conducted extensive assessment interviews following his arrest. Unlike impulsive criminals or those who exhibit escalating patterns of behavior, he committed a single calculated act of violence specifically to protect secrets he had maintained for most of his adult life. His subsequent decades of untroubled existence mere meters from his victim's burial site demonstrates exceptional compartmentalization capabilities, a psychological firewall between his crime and his daily functioning. This compartmentalization had roots in Winters' early life and military service. Born to the Thornley estate's previous caretaker, he had grown up in the same cottage he would later inhabit as an adult. A childhood spent learning the intricate operations of a grand estate and the precise social boundaries between those who owned such properties and those who maintained them. His military record revealed specialized training in logistics and security operations during World War II, followed by assignment to Alfred Thornley's Art Recovery Unit in Italy from 1945 to 1948. His military experience provided both practical skills and psychological conditioning relevant to his later actions, observed military historian Colonel James Matthews, consulted during case preparation. Winters served in operations requiring absolute discretion, often involving high-value asset transport under unofficial protocols. His unit operated in the gray areas between official recovery of looted art and opportunistic acquisition, an environment where selective truth and compartmentalized knowledge became operational necessities rather than moral compromises. This background created the foundation for Winters' role in the Thornley family's post-war antiquities acquisition. Shipping records and military correspondence recovered during the renewed investigation revealed he had personally overseen transport dozens of artifacts from Italy to Britain between 1946 and 1952. Items diverted from official recovery channels through documentation that deliberately misrepresented their significance and provenance. Most tellingly, financial records discovered in a hidden compartment beneath his cottage floor revealed a compensation structure extending far beyond normal caretaker wages. Beginning in 1948, Winters had received annual payments from Thornley Family Trust labeled as service recognition, but representing percentages of valuation increases in illegally acquired collection. These payments, invested carefully over decades, explained his otherwise inexplicable property holdings and investment portfolio. Winters wasn't merely a servant protecting family secrets, noted financial investigator Simon Peters. He was effectively a silent partner in the illegal acquisition enterprise, someone whose continued discretion was ensured through ongoing financial participation in the scheme's benefits. His loyalty was reinforced by regular compensation directly tied to maintaining secrecy around how the collection was obtained. This financial arrangement transformed understanding of his motive for killing Emily beyond abstract loyalty to employers. He had direct personal financial interest in preventing exposure of the collection's problematic provenance. International law increasingly supported repatriation of illegally acquired cultural artifacts regardless of how much time had passed since their appropriation. Emily's research threatened not just Thornley's family reputation, but Winters' own financial security and potential criminal liability for his direct involvement in the original acquisitions. The investigation revealed how thoroughly Winters had monitored Emily's research activities in the months before her death. His position as caretaker had given him legitimate access to all areas of the estate, including the archives where she conducted her historical investigation. Library records showed he had checked out several of the same reference volumes Emily had used, apparently tracking her research path. Most disturbingly, a journal recovered from his cottage documented specific concerns as she approached sensitive areas in her investigation. She's examining the 1947 to 48 shipping manifests. One entry noted, "Ask specific questions about Mediterranean transport routes today. Mention my name in connection with Naples documentation." Becoming problematic. This surveillance had extended beyond the estate to Emily's personal life. The unidentified calls to her cottage, brief connections that had puzzled the original investigation, were confirmed through modern telecommunications analysis as originating from a phone box near the manor service entrance, one conveniently located for Winters' use without creating traceable records. His fingerprints on her bedroom window frame indicated physical monitoring of her activities at home, likely to determine what research materials she kept there and what she might have discovered. Winters conducted classic predatory surveillance, observed criminal behaviorist Dr. Rachel Morrison. He systematically gathered intelligence about her research progress, assessed the threat level to his interests, and monitored her movements to identify opportunity. This wasn't impulsive violence, but calculated elimination of a specific threat following thorough preparation and risk assessment. The psychological assessment revealed how thoroughly Winters had rationalized his actions. During post-arrest interviews, he displayed neither remorse nor particular concern about his circumstances, instead focusing on justifying his decision to kill Emily as necessary protection of greater interest than a single life. The artifacts would have been scattered, the collection destroyed, the family ruined, he stated with remarkable composure. Generations of careful stewardship undone, because a young teacher couldn't appreciate the complexities of the post-war period. Some history requires protection from those who would judge the past by present standards. I preserved something valuable at the cost of someone who would have destroyed it without understanding its true worth. This rationalization reflected the particular moral framework Winters had constructed, one where protection of the Thornley legacy and its physical manifestation in the artifact collection justified extreme measures. His military experience had provided both the tactical capabilities for violence and the psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to commit murder, conceal evidence, and continue his daily life without apparent distress or behavioral changes that might have triggered suspicion. The respected caretaker performance in the aftermath of Emily's disappearance represented perhaps his most remarkable deception. Records from the original investigation showed he had voluntarily assisted search efforts, providing estate maps and suggesting areas to examine, while carefully directing attention away from his cottage and his Victorian garden. He had attended the memorial service held for Emily in 1995, standing solemnly with other village residents while her parents pleaded for information about their missing daughter. Most chillingly, Winters had continued maintaining his garden with meticulous care for nearly 3 decades, cultivating ornamental plantings directly above where he concealed Emily's remains. The stone feature installed above her burial site in early 1995 had apparently served dual purposes. preventing casual discovery of disturbed ground, while creating a physical memorial visible only to the person who understood its true significance. The psychological sophistication is remarkable, noted Dr. Hughes. Winters created a private remembrance marker that simultaneously concealed his crime and acknowledged it, a physical manifestation of his compartmentalization that allowed him to literally tend the garden above his victim's remains without apparent psychological distress. As the case progressed toward trial, the village of Wrenfield confronted the disorienting revelation that the respected caretaker, who had been a fixture of community life for generations, had committed the crime that had haunted them for decades. Winters' identity as the perpetrator forced fundamental reassessment of assumptions about known versus unknown threats, community insiders versus outsiders, and the reliability of long-established reputation as indication of character. "We spent 28 years looking outward for threats," observed Reverend Michael Collins, who had succeeded the now-deceased Thomas Hartley as vicar. "We warned our children about strangers, unknown risks, external dangers, all while the person responsible walked among us daily, tended the manor garden for tourists, attended church services and village events." The psychological adjustment required is profound, recognizing that danger wore the familiar face of someone universally respected rather than the imagined features of an unknown outsider. This adjustment proved particularly challenging for Richard and Helena Thornley, who had employed Winters throughout their adult lives and trusted him with every aspect of estate operations. The investigation revealed that while they had been aware of the collection's problematic provenance, having inherited both the artifacts and the secrecy surrounding them from Richard's father, they apparently had no knowledge of Winters' direct action against Emily. Their complicity existed in maintaining family secrets about acquisition methods and resisting potential repatriation claims rather than participation in or knowledge of murder. The Thornleys faced legal consequences regarding the artifacts. Prosecutor Jonathan Blake explained, "International cultural heritage treaties and case law increasingly support repatriation of improperly acquired antiquities regardless of time elapsed. However, forensic evidence specifically connects Winters rather than family members to Emily Thornfield's death, with financial records suggesting he acted to protect his own interests alongside family reputation. This distinction proved crucial as the case proceeded toward trial. The Thornleys faced separate legal proceedings regarding cultural heritage violations and potential repatriation claims, but evidence indicated Winters had acted independently in eliminating the specific threat Emily posed, making a calculated decision based on his own financial stake in maintaining secrecy rather than acting under direction from his employers. On February 14, 2023, Harold Winters entered a guilty plea to the murder of Emily Thornfield, accepting a life sentence that, given his age, ensured he would spend his remaining years in prison. The plea agreement came after prosecutors presented the overwhelming technological evidence against him, evidence he recognized would be irrefutable despite the 28 years that had passed since his crime. For Emily's elderly parents, Winters' conviction provided long-delayed accountability alongside the proper burial they had finally been able to give their daughter. "Nothing returns Emily to us," her mother stated following the sentencing hearing. But knowing the truth after all these years, understanding exactly what happened and why, that provides completion we feared would never come. The caretaker took our daughter's future, but he couldn't ultimately prevent her research from revealing exactly what she had discovered, nor could he escape the consequences once science finally spoke for her. The respected caretaker who had maintained his deception across 3 decades had finally been held accountable, but the impact of his unmasking extended far beyond individual justice to challenge fundamental assumptions about community knowledge, trusted figures, and the reliability of reputation as indicator of character. Harold Winters had constructed a persona so thoroughly integrated into Wrenfield's social fabric that he had become effectively invisible, the ideal camouflage for someone concealing actions that contradicted everything his public identity represented. As Winters began serving his sentence in the prison medical wing at HMP Chelmsford, Wrenfield Village confronted uncomfortable questions about other secrets that might lie beneath its picturesque surface. The revelation that a trusted community fixture, someone who had shaped the physical environment of their village throughout their lifetimes, could conceal such darkness forced broader reassessment of assumptions about who could be capable of violence and deception. Winters' case demonstrates how thoroughly performance can override reality in small communities, observed sociologist Dr. Elizabeth Murray, who studied Wrenfield's response to the case resolution. His reliable, unassuming presence created a persona that deflected scrutiny precisely because it aligned with expectations about his social position. The caretaker was expected to be hard-working, discreet, and loyal, qualities that perfectly facilitated both his original participation in illegal activities and his subsequent concealment of murder. This observation captured the central paradox of the case. The respected caretaker had been able to maintain his deception specifically because his established role in the community created expectations that normalized the very behaviors concealing his crimes. His diligent maintenance of the estate grounds, his respectful interactions with visitors, his quiet participation in village events, all reinforced a persona that simultaneously hid and was hidden by the very performance of respectability he had maintained for decades. For Emily Thornfield, whose dedication to historical truth had cost her life, the final resolution brought a different kind of justice. The research she had pursued had ultimately been vindicated, with international cultural heritage authorities now engaged in formal repatriation processes for dozens of artifacts she had identified as improperly acquired. The historical record she had sought to complete had finally been corrected, though at incalculable personal cost. The respected caretaker had maintained a facade for nearly 3 decades, but the evidence Emily had discovered and the physical traces he couldn't completely eliminate had eventually converged through technological advancement to reveal the truth he had killed to protect. Harold Winters had spent his life tending the Thornley Estate's gardens and grounds, creating beauty that drew visitors from across Britain. His final contribution to that landscape, a carefully placed ornamental stone feature in his private Victorian garden, had ultimately marked not just Emily's burial site, but the limits of his own ability to keep certain truths permanently buried beneath the cultivated surface of respectability.